Greetings, class. Um, it's Valentine's Day 2021. Um, I am going to answer the question, how do institutions promote peace or cause violence? And trying to be topical, I'm going to do two different kind of details in this answer. One, I want to use like literally current events, as in how can we think about the themes and the concepts from this class and this question applying to the recent trial and acquittal of Donald Trump. And the other example I want to use is healthcare, which that was my written response. Healthcare is not a political football. That was assigned for this week. Sorry, for a prior week. It's assigned. I'll check the schedule, but anyway, I make mistakes. I apologize, but you do read it. It's probably one of the most heartfelt pieces I've ever written. It's about the death of my brother. He died at 33, and there's lots of political implications in that. But first, okay, so when thinking about institutions, right? Institutions are things like the government. There are buildings and structures within our government, but on the whole, we talk about the institution of American democracy. And so, if we think about this trial, right? Impeachment is what the House of Representatives do. They vote on it. If they have voted to send charges of to the Senate, then the Senate has a trial, and if they have a two-thirds vote to convict, then there are ramifications and punishment. And this is something that is done. It's similar to other trials, but it's actually a civil, not a criminal process, which is a distinction that we could spend a lot of time talking about, but the significant consequence of that for the purposes of this video is just that the burden of evidence is different in different kinds of cases. In criminal cases, in order to make sure we never send an innocent person to jail, we have a higher threshold. The burden of evidence is beyond reasonable doubt. If you have reasonable doubts, you can't convict someone. And then in some civil cases, and I say some because it's not necessarily established what the standard for the Senate is, but in some civil cases, it's preponderance of the evidence, which would mean that, if you had 50% plus a feather, right? That's all it would take. Whichever side has the stronger argument, even if it's really close, really divided. In any case, so we have this institution of American democracy, and we want to talk about what does American democracy do to establish peace or to promote violence in its actions, and use the example of the trial. And so first and foremost, I want to say that having trials in and of itself is a peace-producing process. Sometimes when we have stronger, more rigorous protections for things like due process and victims' rights and so forth, we can think about it as establishing greater peace. And where we have more authoritarian, tyrannical courts, then we see diminished levels of peace. And if we see things where we would consider the court to be actually not pursuing or reflecting truth and justice, we would say that would be committing acts of violence, right? Corruption as a betrayal to the public trust is a type of structural violence, right? If we're convicting innocent people, that harms those people, it harms communities. So the justice system is a mechanism for delivering on peace. And part of the reason we would say that is that we take the responsibility of retribution and revenge away from the public and place that onto the state. And the presumption is that we can trust the state. And that's an assumption that's not always uh, reflected in attitudes. And again, the more we trust the state, and the more the state engages in our trust by doing good, we're developing again a stronger peace, because what we're showcasing is that despite the fact that people do have differences of opinion and strong, significant disagreements, that we don't have to physically fight in order to get our way, that we can trust that there's some balancing between ideologies and so forth. Right? The weaker the democracy, the more we see the conditions of people using coercion, physical threats, and live in conditions of fear because they don't know what the other side's going to do next, right? And those conditions then sometimes they build up, right? We build up from fear of violence to presentation of violence. And sometimes that presentation is that the side that we were worried was going to come after us does in fact come after us. And in other cases, people act in self-defense. And sometimes they try to preemptively attack, right? They try to get the other side before that side gets them, right? Hostilities. So Democrats, Republicans agree, disagree, probably agree on more things than people admit to. Strength in politics frequently comes from opposing, the other side and saying that I won't let them do X, Y, and Z, when the overwhelming majority of the work of the government is to do stuff that's really pretty nonpartisan. So there's a trial, and then there's a determination, and then we move on. So that's promotion of peace. We don't always agree with things, but we go on to the next day, and you get some, you give some, and to the extent that we're able to pull this off, we've gone a really long time without a civil war. I'd say that that's not such a bad track record, despite imperfections. But there is violence in this, right? And part of the way we could talk about the institution doing violence is that when we see things like Donald Trump as an example of this case, we see things like you get the justice that you can afford, which might not be the best thing to say about his case, since many commentators actually were quite surprised that the former president actually put together such a weak team, given the kind of high stakes nature of his case and his ability to be able to afford to pay for any team. But part of our justice system, and again, civil trial versus criminal trial is a bit different, but people can't necessarily, like, if I get in trouble, I can't afford to hire the best team, and not having the best team might sometimes mean that you're at a disadvantage in terms of somebody being able to protect all the rights afforded to you under the law. The trial, we see one side is arguing that this is an attempt to overthrow an election, not the 2020 election, but the 2016 election, in which the people who voted for Trump, if he's impeached, it's like an attack on their votes. And then the other side's like, Trump's been lying about the 2020 election. And he has whipped people up into a frenzy by telling this lie over and over that he won an election that he clearly lost. By every measure, he lost. He lost the popular vote. He lost the Electoral College. He lost in 61 out of 62 legal cases. The 62nd case that he won really had nothing to do with anything that would impact the outcome of the election. It was about curing ballots or something. So he lost by every, not even stretch of the imagination, just every realistic check on who won and who lost. So anyway, we've got two different sides. And in the end, we've got a population overwhelmingly, right, and completely bipartisan, right? The broad population wanted Donald Trump to be convicted. So a minority of the population is represented by the senators who voted to acquit him. Significant minority, right? Population wants conviction. Population sees the crimes, the heinous actions that took place on January 6th. And at the same time, those in elected power are able to usurp the will of the public. There's a certain violence in that. It's not direct violence. The actions on January 6th were direct physical violence. Police officers lost eyeballs, lost their lives, lost fingers, right? One officer lost 3 fingers. That's violence. The force required to get a finger removed from your hand is not like just a minor detail. Significant force. That's painful in the moment, but like for the rest of your life, you probably would like to have those fingers back for different activities and functions. Anyway, the institution did respond to it, and it reached an outcome that some people will be disappointed with and others will be encouraged by. And Mitch McConnell seems to have promised that what Trump did was horrible, and that he seemed to make the statement clear that criminal charges should be brought up against Donald Trump. Right? He voted to acquit, and he provided the umbrella of cover for other Republicans who voted to acquit, basically under the constitutional argument, which was already settled, but they didn't have to vote based upon the evidence and whether or not they thought that person was guilty. They could acquit for any reason that they wanted to, including politics. It's part of the business, part of the operation. So we'll see if Donald Trump, as president, was above the law, or whether or not the law and his oaths actually did have him bound. Time will tell. But that's our institution. Healthcare. So the next question, we're going to talk about structures. There's some overlap, but our healthcare system, right, the institution of healthcare in America, is for profit. It's has as an intervener that healthcare insurance industry. Right, we have these different features that come together. This is the apparatus of if you get sick and you go to the hospital, this is what happens. So when my brother got sick and went to the hospital, and he was treated by doctors, those doctors then had to turn to insurance companies and look to see what did the insurance companies approve or dictate about what we would call treatment pathways. This isn't to say that I have information that any doctor wanted to do anything for my brother and then got prevented. All I really know for sure is that he went to the emergency room a bunch of times and they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. And I have talked to doctors who weren't explicitly involved in his case, but about his symptoms, and they'll ask me if different tests were run because they think that those tests could have given better information about different factors that were contributing to his poor physical health. But those tests, in some cases, were never performed, right? And that could very well be that a doctor didn't think it was necessary. Like I said, I haven't asked, I don't know. What I'm trying to do is just lay out, right, that if a doctor wants to do something, they might not be able to do that test if they want, because there's a treatment pathway that's been laid out about what an insurance company will pay for. Right? So that's one feature of our institution of American healthcare. But the other feature that I was talking about is actually it is a for-profit institution. This isn't to say that doctors are in the business to make money. Some doctors are out to get rich and some are out to help people. And I think that doctors are entitled to every bit of what they make. In all honesty, it's hard work. It takes lots of training to get there. You don't end up being a doctor in very many cases without having significant student loan debt and so forth. Pay people for what they're worth. Hard work. Let's motivate people, the best and the brightest, to be doctors. Save lives. I'm all for it. But there's other people in this apparatus who are also trying to make money. And again, with treatment pathways. If a treatment pathway, and what I'm saying is factual for at least some cases, if a treatment pathway dictates that one step should be taken before another, because if this one works and this is more cost effective, then the insurance company saves a ton of money over something. But sometimes the delay of doing this thing first before doing this thing means that something is now untreatable or more malignant or whatever it might be, and ends up being fatal as opposed to having been treated. That's a problem. That's a violence. And that's what we would call institutional violence, a kind of structural violence where if you make rules that cause harm, then those rules are violent, right? If we tell people we will give them the surgery they need, but after a 90-day waiting period, and the 90 days of waiting usually means that people are dead before they get the surgery, that's bad business. I'm not saying we have waiting periods for surgery. I'm just trying to think about what the best and most explicit ways of framing this are. Brother went. 18 times he went to the emergency room in the last 6 months of his life. Over and over and over and over, we heard they don't know what's wrong. 33 years old. Went to sleep. Did not wake up. At the time he died, there had been 57 votes to repeal Obamacare. There had been 0 votes to improve Obamacare. This is an institutional failing. Our American democracy had representatives in place who were more motivated to getting rid of Barack Obama's signature legislation, which, hey, there were problems, sure. Clearly something didn't work right. I think my brother probably was savable. I think my brother probably was treatable. I don't know what it would have taken for them to figure out what was wrong with him. 33-year-olds don't usually just fall asleep and die. But instead of voting to improve, they were voting to get rid of. And the impact of not acting to make our healthcare better meant that some people who were sick got worse. Some people who were sick didn't get the treatments that they needed. Some people who were sick and could have been treated, had things been different, died from treatable conditions. If you're a fan of Obamacare or not, It's just an example. Same as a friend of mine giving a description of racism during a presentation said, how many people, right, and there's an audience, how many people have had their appendix removed? Bunch of hands went up. Pretty straightforward procedure, commonplace. How many people know somebody who died of appendicitis? He looks around and he says, me either. But it was his great grandmother, who maybe he would have met had she lived longer, who died of appendicitis while she was being transported from a whites-only hospital to a hospital that would treat black people. And so when you have an institution that supports, right? That wasn't that long ago in this country, right? We had overt segregation. We had water fountains for white people and for colored people. We had hospitals that wouldn't treat black people. We had white people who wouldn't go to places or be served, right? A black person goes swimming in the swimming pool, and the white people might have a fit and say that that pool needs to be drained and bleached before we'll use it again. Direct violence is when people get, assaulted, physically assaulted. Indirect violence is when we have conditions that permit injury, suffering, and harm to others. The institution that's in place to help treat people from their ailments, that's great, right? When the institution has failings that are calculated for political or economic benefit, and people get hurt, that is violence. It happens in a lot of different ways. Institutions promote peace when they discourage those behaviors which would cause suffering and injury to others for personal gain. Institutions cause violence when the things that they are responsible for fuel injury, suffering, and harm to others. Permit the activities that allow people to be discriminated against. Enforce and endorse segregation. Right? Anyway, it's a bummer. I take this stuff seriously. Not a day goes by that I don't just wish my brother was still around. And a lot of us have stories, right? And reflect on those things. What are the things that we could do to make this a better world where we increase the opportunities for survival and combat the forces of injustice? Anyway, see y'all on the next one.